Let's just consider for a moment, we were lucky because we've sort of benefited from our knowledge of the supply chain to get our hands on this kind of vehicle. But obviously you're in the business of placing them in the market for Lex Autolease, Andy. And, one of the factors that's perhaps subduing demand is what people perceive as high cost. So there's a couple of levers, maybe. There's been an extension of the plug-in vehicle grant. I think that is running in its current shape until March 2026.
I think it's running, the grant is going to be there until March 2027, though we don't know whether it's going to be the same values, do we? Yeah.
Right. Okay. And presently on a large van, that's £5,000 off the purchase price, that's subsidised by the government. Mm-hmm. And that reduction in the capital cost of the equipment helps to facilitate a more competitive rental as your proposition. And is it almost comparable these days with combustion engine? So certainly there's more support available from the manufacturers.
That's what I was just going to say. Because the manufacturers now are being driven by the ZEV mandate, they're offering more support on EVs than they are on ICE vehicles. So that and the plug-in grant, is driving the capital cost down.
And the other factor, Andy, I think with a view to those manufacturers achieving their product mix targets, I think part of the strategy, it seems to me, is reducing supply of the combustion engine variants and increasing the supply of the EV variants. Yeah. And you can have an EV variant maybe in 4 weeks where you might have to wait 12 weeks for the diesel one.
Yeah. In some cases, lead times are a lot quicker, aren't they?
Yeah.
Which is interesting, isn't it? What we really need the government to do is two things. Is firstly do something to stimulate the used vehicle market in EVs, because that will help drive down the residual values. Because that's one of the areas of concern at the moment is residual values. Because
and what's the factor there? Is this something to do with the battery and what's typically an 8-year battery warranty? Are people worried that the battery is going to fail on day one of year 9?
I think so. Yeah,
but it seems unlikely that. We read reports, don't we, of real world battery performance exceeding expectation. Yeah. Now that some of them are getting longer in the tooth.
Yeah. I mean, if we take last year's EV rally, for instance, we one of the vehicles that we entered was a Tesla that I think was 8 years old, 8 or 9 years old, and it had about 250,000 miles on the clock, and it had been supercharged most of its life because it was one of the ones that Tesla technicians use. Yeah, so it had been used on superchargers for most of its life. And there was virtually no battery degradation on that vehicle at all. So, that helped sort of debunk that myth a little bit. But, we need to do something to, like I say, to stimulate that used vehicle market, some incentives for people to go out and buy used. There's incentives there to go and buy a brand new EV. What's the incentive to go and buy a used one? And less concerned about the environment and sustainability and things like that.
Yeah. Is towards the end of next year, the Euro 7 emission standard is becoming mandatory. And that considers battery performance as a factor, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
I seem to recall. So the previous Euro standards, which have been going on since the early 90s, haven't they? 93, maybe, Euro 2. There's been a lot of hoo-ha about reaching an agreeable Euro 7 standard, hasn't there? But it extends for the first time beyond particles and gases coming out of the engine. It considers, things like brake dust and tyre dust, and aspects of the battery. Although I'm not quite sure how that's going to be evaluated. Is there some kind of battery performance test?
Yeah, there is battery performance tests, I believe, and I'm not sure about the fine detail of it, but it'll be around battery performance, battery longevity, how recyclable it is, and
would I mean, you may not know the answer to this, but would Lex Autolease plan to include that in, you know, your determination of residual values, an assessment of battery performance? And could it almost be the case that it'd be like a wear and tear item, acceptable levels of battery deterioration, whereas it might be considered negligence or abuse if somebody has somehow trashed the battery by, you know, an unusual charging regime or driving practices or something like that?
Yeah, it's difficult to prove though, isn't it? That's the thing.
Yeah. And what about the notion that some people have discussed of scrappage schemes to assist adoption? Do you think there's any chance that might be adopted as a policy to help accelerate demand?
I mean, it has worked before, hasn't it?
Yeah.
You know, that's really around new vehicles, isn't it? Around the purchase of new vehicles. You know, I don't think it'll do much to stimulate the used vehicle market, which is really what we've got to do. That used vehicle market has got to be stimulated.
And that's what will help to make your proposition a more appealing one.
Absolutely.
Because, of course, you've got to afford a less steep depreciation curve if you can anticipate that it's got some value at the end. Yeah. I think this is the sort of dynamics of contract hire here that we're moving into, but it's quite important because it's a major method of funding a fleet. Especially when you consider with the increasing cost of labour of managing that fleet yourself. I don't know. Does Lex recognise a tipping point of maybe 10 vehicles on fleet? Contract hire becomes a really exciting proposition for the business. That's tough, isn't it? But certainly the bigger the fleet, the more work there is to do to manage it effectively and to keep it in good order. And quite often you'll have non-experts.
Depend on the customer's risk appetite, won't it? Because, you know, they want to take the risk of investing wholly in an asset that's only going to depreciate, or do they want somebody else to take the risk in that depreciation, which is really what leasing does. You know, the lease code takes the risk in the depreciation of that asset. So, you know, if you're leasing a vehicle, you're essentially paying that depreciation plus a little bit of interest, aren't you? You're not paying for the residual value, so somebody else is taking the risk on that.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, and so therefore providing that safety net is part of the real value in the Lex Autolease proposition.
Yeah. I mean, what we are starting to look at is longer lease terms, because you know, EVs can run longer reliably. Yeah. So, you know, we are looking now up to sort of 7 years lease terms rather than the traditional between 3 and 5 years. So that's helped spread that cost.
But why would anybody dispose of an asset when it hadn't utilised its useful life?
I guess at the moment with EVs, they're still developing, aren't they? And some people don't want to tie themselves into a long lease of an EV that in 3 years' time may not be the most up-to-date technology. So if we look back 5 or 6 years at the electric LCVs that were on the market then, you were lucky if they could do 100 miles range, weren't you? They were around about 70 miles, weren't they? If you think of the old Nissan EMV200s and that sort of thing. So, yeah, absolutely. They've come on a great day, and that's my point exactly, you see. If you'd have tied yourself into a 7-year lease back in those days, you know, 4 years down the line, you've still got 3 years to go on that, and then you're watching vehicles come on the road then that can do double your mileage.
And arguably, the biggest improvement from one generation of product to another has to be the e-Sprinter, doesn't it? Whose range on the new variant is almost 3 times that of the first, isn't it? From sort of 80 or 90 miles to in excess of 250. Yeah. And I can wholly agree with your notion that, you know, why would you buy something that's going to be vastly outclassed at any time?
Yeah. But we are going to get to that peak point, aren't we, where you can't squeeze much more range out of a battery, and I think we're getting there, because with a commercial vehicle, it's a compromise, isn't it, between range and payload. You know, if you want greater range, you've got to have a bigger battery or more batteries, and that reduces your payload. So it's a compromise that you've got to decide what's the important part for you, isn't it?